We were among the 3 winners for REBNY Deal of the Year recently. But we want to take a minute to get you and Nicole here, both of Romer and the Boss, to talk a little bit about what I'm calling behind the transaction. So we can really talk about a little behind the scenes of what happened with the transaction, because we know it was clearly a challenging transaction. So one thing that's really important for us when we work as real estate agents is to have a good, solid foundation with us. Obviously, attorneys, mortgage brokers, if you're on the buy side, but we're on the sell side, the listing side for this. Tell me a little bit about how challenging this transaction was.
Yeah, and it was one of the more challenging transactions we've worked on. Mm-hmm. I would say when we first got engaged, it's going to be a 60-day close, settle into a typical deal, right. And it was anything but, as it turns
exactly.
out. And it was super gratifying for Nicole and I to work on this transaction, given the complexity involved and the nuances that we had to explore to get the deal closed. This was originally contemplated as a mortgage contingent deal.
Right.
And it quickly became apparent to, I think, you and to our client that the buyer was going to have some difficulty in terms of financing, right?
Right.
Related to
but here's the reason why then.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
The client was actually a pretty well-renowned actor, and what are the odds? Like, we have a great contract, we have a great number,
beautiful
everyone's
home,
happy, and then out of nowhere, the SAG strike happens. The Screen Actor Guild strike happens, and so that impacted his financing clearly. So we had to pivot, and that's really key, be able to think about how to pivot as a real estate agent, but then also having the attorney support you in the process, because sometimes it could be a bit of a challenge.
Exactly, yeah. So this was originally a mortgage contingent deal. It became clear that the buyer was not going to be able to obtain traditional financing. Mm-hmm. But both parties wanted to do the deal. Yep. So we had a willing seller, we had a willing buyer, and that always helps, of course, in lawyering a transaction. So the first thing we did after we were in contract was we artificially increased the price to allow the buyer to finance their closing costs. But in exchange for doing that, we said to the buyer, look, we'll go down this path with you, but you need to be non-contingent on financing. Mm-hmm. So the buyer waived their financing contingency in exchange for an artificially increased price, which allowed him to finance his closing costs. So that was the first kind of thing that we did to sort of accommodate the buyer, but also protect our seller in making it a non-contingent deal.
Which, in most cases, that's not too uncommon.
Yeah.
But there's more.
There's more. So that was in October of 2023 when we first amended this contract. And then subsequently, so I guess a month and a half passed, we're now in sort of middle of December. We then decreased the price to accommodate the buyer, allowing for that seller's concession. But we also said to the buyer, look, we will go down this path with you and we'll engage with you and allow you to do this. But we said we need to allow you to release a part of the deposit to our seller. Mm-hmm. So we're going to go down this path, but in exchange, we need to have some security that the deal will ultimately close. And in doing so, we said you need to release $176,000 to our seller, which is, by the way, very rare in a transaction.
Absolutely. For
any part of the deposit to be released to a seller.
Right.
And in order to induce the buyer to agree to that, we said you can file a lien against the house if you wish. And then at closing, you can terminate that lien. That'll give you some security that we're not going to walk away as a seller.
Right.
But we do need that money from you now in order to proceed with this deal.
So what happened there is that I now had to find a property. Now, keep in mind, I represent the seller on this. But again, we're all together. We all want to get this deal to work. And so we then had to find a property that the buyer owns in an effort to use as collateral for our client to be happy with doing seller financing.
Right, and the reason, again, was that the buyer no longer qualified to get a traditional financing on this asset in Brooklyn. Mm-hmm. So, Jeff, you correctly identified, well, how do we get this to happen?
Right.
And that is by doing a cash-out refinance on an asset that the buyer owned in Atlanta, I believe.
Correct.
And he utilized, did a cash-out refinance to essentially fund the purchase here in Brooklyn.
Correct.
But I know that there was some complexity in how you engage people and did all these things. So maybe you can explain how
So we had to actually vet an appropriate attorney that's familiar with that in Georgia, and someone that my client was comfortable with. So we went through, I'm going to say 3 to 4 different attorneys until we found the right fit for a client. We ultimately found that, and that's when they created the contract, essentially, protecting our client there in Atlanta, and then Michael and Nicole did similar as such in New York.
That's right, yeah, and I would say it's exceedingly rare in my experience for a seller's agent to help a buyer secure financing on an asset out of the state. Like, that's just a completely rare, I don't think I've ever actually seen that happen on a transaction. So
I'd say that was the first time I've ever done it.
Enormously creative on your end, and then all we did as lawyers was just paper that in the form of a contract amendment.
Right.
So it was typical lawyering from our end, but very creative brokering on your side.
And also someone that plays a pivotal role is Nicole. Like behind the scenes where everything is happening, you and I are talking about it, but now to actually get it on paper, Nicole makes it work. So Nicole, tell me a little bit about how challenging this whole process was.
There was a lot of communication with our seller on all these points. We had to paper these amendments, get his approval for all the decreases and increases that we had to do. And on top of that, there was a lot of open permits and violations on the property that I worked closely with the seller on and the DOB in getting those closed out and releasing funds that we held back in escrow for the closing.
And to that point, the buyer chose to close with open permits.
Yeah, so the key from a representation standpoint was to keep the main goal in mind. And what's the main goal? To get the transaction closed. But at the same time, represent our client vigorously. Mm-hmm. And so at every turn of this transaction, when we accommodated the buyer, we extracted something from them. Right. And the biggest thing was that this was a partial gut renovation, was my recollection on this transaction. And there were a number of open permits and violations, which again is not uncommon when you're doing a renovation of this kind.
Correct.
And so what we did was we said to the buyer's lawyer, look, we'll accommodate you on all these different things, but in exchange, the first thing we said was you have to be non-contingent on financing. And then later on we said, we'll allow you to do all the seller financing and extend our closing time frame significantly, but in exchange, you have to agree to close subject to those open permits and those violations. Right. And that's what we did. Right. We got the buyer to agree to that. We drafted an appropriate escrow agreement for closing, which provided that we would hold some money back until those items were resolved. And ultimately the transaction closed with the buyer sort of dealing with those open permits and violations with our client subsequent to the closing. Right. So that was sort of the main theme of our representation, I would say, again, is extracting concession for our client while allowing the deal to proceed in a way that the buyer wanted as well.
Yeah. And I think the main thing to come out of this is that you have to have the ability to pivot. And that's what we did collectively as a group. And you have to know that you're working as a team. So you have to have the right attorney in place that understands that, but at the same time, keeping in mind the best interest of their client, which is the seller. And then just ultimately the final goal, which as always is to get it to the closing table. And that's what happened.
And that's exactly what happened. And again, it was really creative brokering on your side, thinking outside the box, problem solving on the fly, and then saying to Nicole and I, well, how can we formalize this in the form of a contract amendment, or how do we legalize what I'm thinking and conceptualizing to represent the seller well and allow the buyer to close? And that's exactly what we were able to do. Yeah.